In spite of its development troubles, Half-Life 2 was a huge success and would be a highly influential title for both first-person shooters and video games at large. Players enjoyed the gameplay improvements and were immersed in the game's story and world, and it left fans wanting a sequel, something that Valve was planning to deliver. They were also eager to avoid the rough development cycle of Half-Life 2 so as not to put further strain on the company. So they decided to create smaller games that could be finished in a much shorter time frame. These would not be the eternally confirmed Half-Life 3, but instead a series of standalone expansions that would pick up where the story of Half-Life 2 ended. The first expansion, tentatively titled Aftermath, was announced in 2005, a year after Half-Life 2 was released, and was being targeted for summer of 2006. Aftermath would deal with the immediate consequences of Gordon blowing up the reactor at the end of Half-Life 2, and would focus on Alyx as a character and gameplay mechanic. Eventually, Aftermath was renamed Half-Life 2 Episode 1, and Valve stated that it would be the first in a trilogy of expansions that would continue the story of Half-Life. Valve managed to finish development on time, and Episode 1 launched on June 1st, 2006. As a direct sequel to Half-Life 2 built on the same engine and using upgraded assets from the base game, Episode 1 delivered more of the Half-Life 2 action fans had come to adore. But how does Episode 1 compare to its predecessor? Let's dive in and find out. Half-Life 2 Episode 1 begins right where Half-Life 2 left off, with Gordon and Alyx caught in the explosion of the Citadel's dark energy reactor. This time, however, we see a group of Vortigaunts teleport Alyx and Gordon away to safety. They also prevent the G-Man from interfering with Gordon further, which he is not happy about.
We'll see about that.
Gordon wakes up in the ruins of City 17, where he's freed by Dog, Alyx's robot companion who left such a strong impression on me that I forgot to mention him in the Half-Life 2 video. He reunites with Alyx, and the two of them establish communication with Eli and Kleiner, who inform them that the Citadel core is damaged almost beyond repair. And if it isn't stabilized, the resulting explosion will completely eradicate City 17 before Gordon and Alyx will be able to escape. Gordon and Alyx journey into the Citadel to stabilize the core, which Gordon is able to do despite the presence of stalkers. The result of the Combine genetically modifying humans who resist their enslavement. They also encounter the Combine advisors for the first time, and we won't learn more about them until Episode 2, but we do see their psychic powers severely harming Gordon and Alyx, indicating the immense strength these aliens possess. Gordon brings the core to optimal levels, and Alyx discovers that the Combine were intentionally trying to destroy the Citadel to generate enough power to open a portal to their homeworld, as well as transmit a message to the Combine outside of our dimension. Alyx also finds a message from Judith Mossman, who left the Resistance after Half-Life 2 to discover more information about an unspecified project, though Mossman and her crew are discovered by the Combine before they can divulge details. Alyx copies the Combine transmission and Mossman's message, and hijacks a Citadel train to bring her and Gordon out of City 17. Unfortunately, the train derails, forcing the two to wander through dark, zombie-infested underground ruins to find their way to the surface. There they find that City 17 is almost completely destroyed, and the last few Resistance members are attempting to evacuate the city via train. After fighting the scattered remains of the Combine, Gordon and Alyx reunite with Barney and help him get the rest of the citizens to safety. Gordon and Alyx take the last train out and watch as the Combine transmit their message and the Citadel begins collapsing. The Citadel's destruction absolutely obliterates City 17, with Alyx and Gordon's train getting caught in the explosion, and the game ends with their fate unknown. The overarching story of Episode 1 is pretty bare bones, with your only goal throughout the game being to escape City 17. It plants the seeds for stuff we'll see in the next game, like the Advisors and a brief glimpse of the Combine Hunters, but the basic plot is straightforward and consequently underwhelming. Episode 1 also carries over Half-Life 2's approach to narrative design, telling its story through dialogue sequences and scripted events. That means that if you didn't enjoy how Half-Life 2 presented its story, you won't enjoy it here either, but considering Episode 1 is a direct follow-up, the similarity makes sense. The biggest change to the narrative is a greater emphasis on Alyx as a character. Alyx plays a much larger role in this story, not just as a companion to Gordon, but also helping to convey the emotional weight of the events happening around you. She reacts to objects and events that you encounter, both minor and major ones, which is used to both help guide the player and provide some flavor text. It also gives the player a proxy that allows them to relate to every situation. Half-Life and Half-Life 2 relied heavily on the principle of letting the player's own reactions to events speak on their own, which is either more or less immersive depending on your viewpoint. Episode 1 ditches this for the most part and uses Alex as a way to keep the player invested in the world around them and provide context for crucial plot points. Neither approach is necessarily better than the other, and while previous games had a mastery of environmental storytelling and directing the player's attention to story beats, a character-driven narrative makes more sense in this case, considering that Valve wanted to develop Alex's character and relationship with Gordon. And I think it pays off because I enjoy Alex as a character, and her interactions with Gordon / the player show off a good range of emotions and moods. She gets angry, frustrated, sad, etc. when the situation calls for it, while occasionally lightening the mood with a snarky quip, and never goes too far one way or the other. And the game drops even more hints of Alex's romantic feelings towards Gordon, though they're a little more obvious this time around. The writers didn't want Alex to feel robotic and worked to keep her dialogue fresh throughout the game, which is augmented by her voice performance by Merle Dandridge.
God damn the Combine. This is what happens to you if you resist. Or if you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
She feels like a genuine human character, not just a tag-along that becomes a burden for the player to keep track of. She isn't just a narrative device though, because while Episode 1's base gameplay is the same, Valve added a new gameplay features that complement Alex's role in the story. Alex is still capable of defending herself and Gordon well enough, and she chooses to follow Gordon instead of leading him, meaning the player can still progress at their own pace. Thus, it never feels like she's dragging you down, though there are times where her AI takes a little bit too long to figure out what Alex is supposed to do next for scripted events. Which was a problem that was present for Half-Life 2's NPCs as well. Because Alex tags along for the whole journey, Valve deliberately designed the maps to show the player what Alex can do and let them experience the effects of her presence. Maps have more enemies overall, making it more difficult to survive without Alex's help. You don't have any weapons aside from the gravity gun for the first half of the game, so you need Alex to take care of enemies outside its range or who require more firepower. And even when you do get other weapons, the arsenal is smaller and ammo is initially extremely scarce, so you'll still need Alex to clear out combat sections. In dark areas, she'll shoot at enemies that you shine your flashlight on, and thankfully the flashlight seems to drain less power than it did in Half-Life 2. Although it's still tethered to the energy meter, which makes the fight with zombies while waiting for the elevator much more tense. She can also reconfigure roller mines so they'll attack the Combine and Xen aliens instead of Gordon and Alex, which is sometimes required for puzzle solving. It's perfectly possible to advance through the game while ignoring Alex's assistance, but thankfully her constant presence never becomes a serious problem, which is great, because if Alex was a burden during the adventure, the game would be downright unplayable. Gordon will face up against two new enemies, the first being the Stalkers, whom we saw briefly in Half-Life 2. They won't attack you unless you aggravate them first, but they can disable switches that you need to activate, so getting rid of them is always a good idea, since their laser attack doesn't do much damage and can easily be avoided by strafing. The other new enemy is the Zombine, which, as you can imagine, is a zombified Combine soldier, and no, the game is not subtle about dropping that name on the player. These zombies are not only faster and more aggressive than regular zombies, but thanks to their Combine armor, they take much more damage to be killed. They can also pull out grenades and attempt to suicide bomb you, but you can grab grenades out of their hands with the gravity gun and launch it back at them. Overall, the new gameplay elements are enjoyable, and as you'd expect, the gameplay isn't too much of an evolution from Half-Life 2. The same goes for the aesthetics, which is stylistically the same, but features a few improvements to touch up the overall look. Episode 1 adds the HDR rendering introduced in Lost Coast, as well as improving the lighting engine and visual effects. Valve also boosted the facial models and animations to allow for more intense reactions from characters, which is a minor change, but it helps sell the emotions of the dialogue and story. While the graphical fidelity is great, even better than Half-Life 2, I do wish that the locations you traveled in were more varied. The only two environments you travel through are the Citadel and ruined City 17, both of which we played through in Half-Life 2, which does make it difficult for these areas to stand out. But there are subtle differences that make them slightly distinguishable from the previous game. City 17, for example, features much more rubble and falling ashes, and the atmosphere of the Citadel has an orange hue that represents its imminent destruction. These areas look fantastic on their own, but they're areas we've already traveled through, and while they look better, it isn't enough to give Episode 1 its own distinct look. Though a part of why I think that might be because I just played through Half-Life 2, so that game and its visuals are still fresh in my mind. Episode 1 features a brand new soundtrack as well, and it's alright. The music leans more on the atmospheric side, with emphasis on drones and slower-paced electronica songs, and many of these tracks are legitimately good. It's just not as strong of a soundtrack overall as Half-Life 2's, and it feels a little more disjointed in terms of tone and dynamics, with many tracks blending into each other. Though thankfully, the use of music is more restrained, meaning the songs appropriately add to the atmosphere of the moment without feeling overwhelming. As the next chapter in the Half-Life saga, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 does its job adequately, providing new content while sticking to the core design of Half-Life 2. Which it does to both its advantage and disadvantage. It's not a bad game on its own merits because Half-Life 2's base gameplay is still excellent, but comparing it to its immediate predecessor and successor, it does feel lacking. It doesn't feel like a true follow-up, it feels like the beginning of a much greater adventure, which would be fine if it wasn't sold and distributed by itself. I have come to appreciate Episode 1 as a solid game, as I've always viewed it more as a footnote, which isn't fair considering the gameplay features and character development. But the episodic formula does work against it, as it's over way too quickly and it doesn't do enough to escape the faults of Half-Life 2. It feels a lot like a standalone DLC campaign actually, though it was released long before DLC was a widespread phenomenon for AAA titles. And since it only takes a few hours to complete, it doesn't feel like a waste of time, even if it is objectively the least interesting of the Half-Life 2 trilogy. While Episode 1 was a decent continuation, it still left players wanting more, and they eagerly awaited the release of Half-Life 2 Episode 2. They wouldn't have to wait that long, as Episode 2 would be released the very next year, and although it wasn't intended to be so, it would be the last Half-Life game for 13 years.